Okay. Well, we will get started. How many of you here, by a show of hands, have run experiments with your startups? Joshe has. Okay. Andre has. Okay, cool. Um, Let me show you our latest experiment with Growth University, and then we'll dive in. Has anybody seen this on our site? Probably not, I would assume. But this form, what this thing is our latest experiment to try to understand how do we get another iteration closer to the problem or problems that our startup founders are facing, so that ultimately what we end up doing is building either content to solve those problems or some future product to solve those problems. And so this is one of the things that we're constantly doing at GrowthU, is saying, okay, well, what do we need to learn? What is our goal around our own learnings, and how do we go about doing that? And it may drive the team crazy at times, but what we're really trying to do is shorten the lifespan of the gap that we have in knowledge about our own customers. And so we'll ask questions about, hey, what are your challenges with growth? What are the things that you might need help with? And what these things do is these things will help you get a little bit closer to understanding what it's going to take to get to that next iteration of learnings. And so you'll see us kind of like constantly go through this process. I think so far we've probably gotten maybe 10-ish responses to that. And we're starting to already see some commonalities among some of the challenges that people visiting our site, who we don't know at that point because they're not authenticated, are telling us. And so today I want to dig in a little bit on experimentation. That's this week's theme. And before we dive too deeply, what I'd like to start with is the view of statistical significance and experimentation is one that often gets talked about a lot. And in many of us, when we start out thinking about experimentation for our startups, we think we need to be really scientific about it, or we need a lot of rigor. Sometimes you don't. And especially when you're really just getting started with your model and started getting traction in your market, sometimes it's the kind of wild and wacky things that you try that will actually move the needle. And sometimes they are statistically significant and sometimes they're not. So we'll walk through some examples of this as we go today. But today we're going to cover how to build a proper growth experiment, how to think about experimentation. I'll show you some examples. We'll talk about measurement and some of the tooling around it, and then open it up to any questions we might have at the end. As we alluded to in week one's theme, startups need to move really quickly. And really what we're looking for here is a signal. And so I love Max Levchin's quote that the only predictable thing about startups is their unpredictability. You all are probably feeling this. I know we are. And then Reed's, if you aren't embarrassed by the first version. And also Catherine's. I mean, these are just fantastic quotes. And again, with the fast pace of a startup and creative people, we tend to generate a ton of ideas. And then we often have this glorified view of experimentation that, hey, we got this idea, we're going to launch this experiment or this test, and we're going to change some things around, and then it's going to work magically, and our conversion rates are going to go up, and everything's going to be great. But often we then find like, okay, well, whatever I did didn't really have as much of an impact as I thought it had. But next test is going to be awesome. It'll work this time. And then we're like, I don't know. Is this working? Did the experiment work? Did it provide the results? Did it provide the learnings that I needed to find out at that point in my startup journey? And oftentimes it just doesn't really work. So we're going to dig into this. But before that, there are worse things than just failing at experimentation. Sometimes you're going to get a false positive and you're going to go build a bunch of stuff that turns out customers don't want in the first place, but you were working off of a false positive. And other times you might get a false negative. So you may actually run into the opposite problem where you give up on something that could have been a great idea, but you just didn't feel it. And so it goes away, never to be visited again. So what are you supposed to do? I think there's a way to kind of build proper experiments, and there's a few steps here. Probably the most important is actually building a hypothesis and documenting what your hypothesis is. And what this is like, what do you actually want to learn? What is the thing that you're set out to do? Why are you running an experiment in the first place? The next thing you have to understand is, what are you measuring against? What is that control? The third thing is kind of, what are you changing to make an experiment? How are you going to measure this thing that you're doing? How do you track your results? And then do you scale this experiment? Do you kill it? Do you kind of let it run for a longer period of time? And we'll get into this as we go here. But the first step around building a hypothesis is that anything that you really truly want to test, you should build a testable hypothesis for. And you should probably write that down in a document. So for example, the format is something like this. By doing or not doing something, usually to the product, usually some kind of action, we believe that some metric will be impacted, usually positively. Okay. Then what you need to do is look at, what is the historical data that we have? And again, this can be hard data. This can be conversational data. It doesn't necessarily have to be this massive amount of data, but what are we comparing whatever results we have against? And we call this like a control, or we call this a baseline. And then it's like, what are the things that you're changing? So are you adding something? Are you removing something? Are you changing a color? Are you moving a button? Are you hiding an entire piece of functionality? Are you radically changing onboarding? And you put those into these different versions of the product, and then you expose that version of the product to a population, and then you measure the input of that against whatever your control is. And the control, again, is whatever has been happening up until now. Now, you may have one or more of these variants that you want to work with over time. Now, if you're very low volume, so if you have a few users that come in, if you're generally enterprise SaaS is a little bit harder to experiment with because you just have less volume to work with. Consumer social is generally very easy to experiment with because you've got enough kind of volume and velocity that you can basically put different versions of your product in front of different people. And like what I showed you with the Growth University current experiment, it's not really it's not an A/B test. Like we just put this overlay on the site to try to capture some data. And later on, we're going to look at that data and we're going to say, did we learn something from these users that made it possible for us to drive them into membership faster or into exposing areas of our platform where there might be gaps? So this will take us a little while to figure out. But we've got some volume, and we're also very risk tolerant as a growth company, right? We try things all the time, but you may have a different scenario. So the thing that you want to think about is kind of volume versus risk. And the higher volume you have, the lower risk you actually have when running radical experimentation. When you're doing these variants, you're going to want to include the people amongst your team who are going to be impacted by that experiment. And I've gotten myself in a ton of trouble, especially at the bigger companies that I've worked at, running experimentation. Like literally have gotten yelled at for running experiments, and kind of that's part of the job, but also like in hindsight, there are better ways to do this. Know what you're measuring, know how you're going to measure your tests. So determine what results you're going to look at and make sure that you kind of understand or can quantify your results, and then track your results. Obviously, we like to do a lot of analysis here at GrowthU. We could probably be a little more formal than we are, but generally we'll kind of look at experimentation on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. I find like a weekly cadence of measurement, reviewing what's happening with your experiments is a good way to look at it. And then you have to get to a decision point. Like, what is your next step with whatever experiment or test that you're running? Are you going to kill it? Are you going to try something different and write another variant? Does this test become some roadmap item that you have? Because remember, the fastest growing startups are often blending a product vision that their founding team or their core team has, all the stuff that has to be built, along with ideally stuff that's coming out of experiments. And I'll show you some examples of what we did at Sandbox on this side. And I'm going to start actually with Upside, business travel platform. This basically was a one-stop shop to coordinate everything around your business trip. So early on, I ran growth there for about a year and a half, and the company was founded by the founders of Priceline. So it was highly capitalized. We had basically a limitless budget, which was kind of fun and unique and also scary. But so we had this idea: if cart abandonment works so well in e-commerce, could we apply the same logic and rules to the shopping experience of booking travel? And so the way that I like to quantify a lot of the different iterations of a test or an experiment are that you basically go from nothing, like you're not running an experiment, you're not testing something, to this 0 to 1 phase where you're testing something usually small, usually very manually. And then as you get a little bit more sophisticated with your experimentation, you add a little bit more polish, you have a little bit more metrics and data, maybe a higher volume of people see your experiment. Eventually you get team buy-in, your idea becomes a feature, and then you're in this constant state of incremental improvements that you're making to your product that's driven from this experimentation that you're doing. And so we said, okay, well, if our hypothesis is that we believe abandoned cart could work for travel, what's the easiest way that we can test this? Because we don't want to spend a ton of time or capital on an experiment if we've got no conviction of whether or not it's going to work. So, but what we did have was we did have emails from a lot of our users who were coming through our travel experience and searching for things. And then right when they get to that shopping cart where they have to put in their credit card to buy their business trip, they leave. And so that was the moment that we said, okay, we think there's something that we can work with there. So the first thing we did was we said, okay, well, can we increase the percentage of the users who hit the booking experience by sending them an abandoned search email, very similar to how e-commerce works with abandoned cart. So the first iteration was for users who did a trip search but did not complete it, can we increase the percentage of them that end up booking it? Okay, well, what was our control? We didn't have one because we didn't have any, like all we had was what we weren't doing, which was the lack of experimentation. So we had to build our control as we went. Now, this is the very rough version 1. This is the first variant that we put out there. It didn't have any personalization really. It had the person's first name most of the time. So it'd say, "Hey, Craig, it looks like you're planning a trip to a new destination." There was no personalization in the message here either. So it was just this generic piece of content that we thought added some value. So it looks like you're planning a trip to a new destination. Check out the Upside blog. We'll help you prepare for your trip. We've got how-tos and all that great stuff. And then here are 3 articles popular with business travelers right now. So notice we leveraged existing content for this thing. We didn't go and build a bunch of stuff. We didn't spend a ton of time. It was very, very, just very straightforward. Okay. Again, because we didn't have prior data, we just didn't want to spend a lot of time on it. But we got sign off and we were able to kind of experiment in this part of our funnel. So what did we need to measure? We needed to measure the percentage of email recipients who came back after receiving that email to start a new session. That was number 1. That was the tipping point of engagement. So if we had all of these users who were never hearing from us again, what happens if they hear from us now? Do they come back and do they start a new session? Do they start looking for more business trips? The second thing was, what percentage of those email recipients started the checkout process, right? So like, did they get to that last step? Not even did they buy yet, but did we have that directional signal yet that we were onto something? Okay, so let's look at some metrics. With the original email, so this I guess was our new control, 31% of recipients started a new session and 30% of recipients started the checkout process. Remember, it was 0 before. So just by sending that very kind of vanilla version of a non-personalized, get you back into the funnel, we saw these metrics. And again, we were comparing against nothing, so that became our new control. We thought, okay, this is kind of cool. Like we've got a signal there. Okay, well, at that point we said there's enough here. The click rate was high enough, the engagement rate was high enough that we said, what happens if we take this to the next iteration and spend a little bit more time with it? Let's let it bake a little bit more. Because that first test left a lot out. There was no personalization of the trip details. A lot was lacking. So we revised our hypothesis and we said, okay, well, now by providing personalized or regional content relevant to the destination that the user is searching for, we thought we could increase engagement even further between us and that user. And again, we had some data. This was version 2. So version 2, all of a sudden, we took the system data that knew that this person was looking at booking a trip to Copenhagen. And we said, hey, it looks like you're planning a trip to Copenhagen. So we merged in, that was a dynamic field, right, for the city. And what we also did was behind the scenes, we created a simple table of all the articles and pieces of content that we had for a city. And we wrote a conditional in this email that said, if city X, look at the table and see what articles do we have that we can share with that person, and what custom images do we have, if any. So this may or may not have an image in it, but if we had an image associated with the city of Copenhagen, then we would merge that in as well. Boom. Okay, so let's see what happened here. So we personalized the subject line, we personalized the content, we added that image, we added that article. Again, our goal, increase the percentage of users who initiated the checkout compared to the control. Number 2 goal, percentage of checkout initiated events compared to control. So again, we're going for engagement. Variant 2, 36% of recipients started a new session, which was not as huge of a gain as we thought, but it was still 16% relative increase. But then 46% of recipients started the checkout process. So that personalization made it so that they were much more inclined to go deeper down into our funnel. And that was a 53% increase compared to the control. Now, remember what the work was. Early on, it was like totally vanilla. We just started something that was like a few hours of work. The variant 2 took like a day or two to pull off because we had to build this table. We had to source, we had to build the new subject line. We had to merge these fields in. So there's a little bit of like data work that had to happen there, but it wasn't extensive. We certainly were not building a new feature yet. And now remember, our goal was to increase the percentage of users that start that checkout process, and that variant saw a 53% increase. So that was super exciting. But what was also interesting was that when we looked at the bookings in our control group, so the earliest version, 9% of recipients ended up booking. In our variant, 15% booked. That's a 67% increase when you look at it relatively. Total game changer. Like this all of a sudden was a viable thing that started with this really, really simple experiment. And so then we said, okay, well, how do we productize this? So during the next few weeks and months, we did more experimentation. We baked that even more. We added better content. We added more content. We made it more personalized. We made it look better. And then we built that in as a feature, right? So engineering was our scarcest resource at the company. It took all of that to get that to become the feature idea. And then we put that into the feature roadmap. And now all of a sudden that became part of what we just had the user experience every day. And it went through this process. And then it moved into the spot of like constant optimization where we're tweaking and tuning it, but we're trying to make it better. But it was more or less done. That's how we look at this. I'll get another example. This is directly in the e-commerce space. This is a hair shop that I did some work on, which I use this example because it's just utterly simple. And I wanted to show sometimes how simple getting some of the iterations and change actually are. So hair shop had a 3-hour abandoned cart sequence that would basically, if you get to the cart and you leave, you get an email 3 hours later that says, hey, come back to buy. Okay. Past 30 days, this is some data. Roughly 1,300 emails had been sent, open rate of 38%. And we had a 1.04% open to order rate, which was quite low. Like you want that to be kind of in the 2 to 5% range usually. 7 orders. Okay, what do we do? So again, this is really simple stuff, but we changed the design and the calls to action. So this is what it was before. Okay, don't forget your main awaits, shop now. And then this was basically I think this was Klaviyo was the platform being used. It was just the default abandoned cart experience. And what I had done was came in and said, what happens if we just like try to personalize a little bit more? What do we have available that's easy to an easy lift? So we updated the design, the calls to action, and then did a separate test where we changed the subject line. And then a third one with a different subject line. So we had enough volume where we're like, okay, we'll test 3 things at once. Here's the control versus the variant kind of side by side. So again, a little bit of personalization on the right, a big button that says continue order. Like we're saying, like, we're not making it any question of what our goal is. We want you to just simply continue that order. Okay, so measurement, that open order percentage metric was what we were looking at because it's a revenue goal. Okay, so some of the data, tracking results, open to purchase, 1.04 on the control. The first variant was a 3.65 open to purchase. Tripled it. Variant 2, 3.62. Variant 3, 3.78. So what's interesting is like a lot of the aesthetic changes when compared against one another didn't really make that big of a difference. But the lack of personalization to personalization, where we showed what was in that cart and we had a very clear call to action that continue shopping, was the thing that made the difference in this. And so then we reached a new baseline. We said, okay, well, clearly this is now working. We went from 1.04% to 3.8. It's almost a 4x return. What else can we do? Because we'd run 3 variants. We're like, I think we've kind of beat this abandoned cart into the ground. Maybe we can get that to 4.5, maybe 5% over the next year through experimentation. But like the heavy lift is done. Well, what happens if we add a second email a couple hours later? So to the ones that didn't convert. And again, this is out of the box functionality for a lot of these platforms that many of us don't even use. We proceeded to add that second abandoned cart email 24 hours later after the first, and it was similar to the first one. And that drove 50% of new revenue compared to email 1, which ended up being thousands of dollars in revenue, literally for just churning something on and giving it 15 minutes of thought. Seriously. And so what I'd urge you to do here is just think about that entire journey with your user. And this is true not just for e-commerce. This is true for when we're doing sales and touch points with potential members. It's when we're doing lead gen forms. We've got drip campaigns and sequences that folks go into. This is true if you're a consumer company. So just think about that entire journey and look for areas where you can run experimentation. And often it's when you have nothing and you go to building something in to solve a particular transition point. It's where it gets interesting. I'm going to show you one more example here with Sandbox. And so myself, as well as Aoife Jacob, who runs a lot of our activation strategies, both worked at Sandbox. I was the chief product officer. She was a growth lead and really kind of owned this part. So she gets all the credit for this. So we had this core product that allowed users to download our app and for $4 digitally compose a letter that would get sent to their family member or friend who was at basic training for the military. And for $4, you could get that sent overnight. We had experimented with this concept of what we call the content letter. And this content letter was an add-on to our core product. It was an ancillary revenue experiment. So we said, right now we're selling a little bit of this content letter, which is just an add-on that you basically click a button and you get this new thing added to your cart. What happens if we get aggressive with it? So here's our control. So this is kind of what it looked like. This was like the earliest version of it. And you should check out Sandbox if you got any military members in your cohorts. It's a fantastic product for connecting with them. This is an example of some of the content that you could just add into your shopping cart. So in the past 3 months, less than 1/3 of users who purchased the main product purchased the weekly letter, which is this thing. Okay, so not amazing. So we tried different variants. We would send an SMS message 10 minutes after they sent that original product. So like the main thing that they buy, we would try to cross-sell them into buying this content letter. That was the first variant. Second variant, we would do a push message 30 minutes after they redeemed any promo code on our platform. And the third was once we had a baseline from this test, because we were like, you have to be able to beat this 0.03% conversion. Like if we can't figure this out, then that's a problem. So we were like, let's see. So we assumed we were going to get better. And once we had a baseline from this, then we're going to start to A/B test creative. Again, we're measuring the percentage of regular product purchases that attach a weekly letter purchase. So the analogy for some of your companies that are non-e-commerce is like, what is the additional benefit or value that you can sell on top of your core product? Or what's the adjacent thing you might sell on top of whatever you're selling right now? Okay, variant 1, SMS 10 minutes had a 2.2% attach rate. The push had a 4.5% attach rate. And variant 3 didn't make any difference at all. Changing the creative and the messaging didn't really matter. There was no statistically significant percent change. The reason why this experiment worked was because we went from not doing something to doing something. And the push actually worked much, much better. And so then you're at a position where you're looking at your data and you're saying, okay, well, we're at 0.3 before. Here's variant 1, variant 2. What do we do? We've clearly reached a new baseline. What do we do after that? We build this into the product, right? The growth team was doing all of this stuff around the edges of the product, right? Like there was a lot of manual work that had to happen to validate and get through this experiment. And so we said, well, we've basically 10x'd our return on this cross-sell functionality. What happens if we build into the product? And that's in fact what we ended up doing. And a few months after launching these experiments, that little idea became about 15% of the revenue of this business line, which is just kind of incredible when you think about it. And so I just wanted to share that, like these experiments, you may think they're these big, big, big things, but often they're not. Often it's that realization that there's an area that you've just missed and you just need to churn something on. And sometimes that's what it takes. In terms of running and tracking experiments, this is an example that I pulled from that experience. We measured everything and put everything into Notion. I would say more importantly though, this is the template that you can use. And there's a downloadable version of this in WordPress, but basically document your process. You should have a templatized version of this that you use for your experiments, and you kind of share that out with your team. What's your overview? What's your hypothesis? What are you measuring against? And then basically look at this thing every week and see what is happening with the different experiments that I'm running. You can prioritize using like the RICE framework from Intercom, for example. This is like my own flavor of that includes engineering as one of the variables, but also includes marketing efforts. And what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to put out ideas that I can try to quantify what the output's going to be. So what do I think the impact is going to be in terms of like, is it going to be huge impacts? Like a 9 or 10 would be a 25% plus relative gain over whatever my control is. Is it totally unknown? So in this case of the first one, abandoned cart email 1, I had an impact of 7 because I thought like this would have like a pretty good impact. What's my confidence? Like how confident am I that this is going to work? How much engineering do I need to pull off this experiment? In this case, it was 0, and I was very confident. How much effort does marketing have to put in? How much effort does anybody else need to put in? 0. And then you just crunch the numbers and you come up with a score. And then you just work on the highest score first. And then by the time you get lower and lower and lower, it's like you have the trade-offs internally to decide like, what do you work on versus what do you not work on? So at some level of scale, this is how you quantify it. This is even beyond a lot of what we're doing even now within Growth U. Like we haven't quantified everything. We're still doing a lot of those like 0 to 1 experiments right now. But at some level of scale, for those of you that are at a later stage, when you're running a lot of data through the system and you've got a lot of customers, this is the way you're going to probably want to think about quantifying it. And then you measure in terms of look back. This is actually real data from one of the experiments, and it tracked what is the experiment kind of in reverse cron order. So we're at test 33 here by the time I pulled these numbers. So like we've gone through 30 iterations of the experiment over many months. So this is much later stage at that point. But you basically want to measure these variants against your control, where the control kind of is the top line here, right? So again, you're going to have different metrics. It's going to look a lot different than this, but you want to look at that performance of your core metric against the control to give yourself a sense of like, hey, did this work? Did this not work? Not everything here worked amazingly well. Like sometimes you'll see negative numbers. So there's an 11% in here. Sometimes you'll spend a bunch of time on something and the experiment just totally fails, and that's perfectly normal and that's totally okay. What you don't see above here is a lot of that failure, right? Especially in the stage where you're not yet in optimization, but you've hit all of the easy things to pick off. You're going to have negative weeks. You're going to have negative impacts that come in, and that's totally okay. Then just some thoughts on false positives and false negatives. It's almost embarrassing to talk about, but one of my SaaS platforms that I shared in week 1 around failure was we were getting signals from our investors, and we're getting signals mostly from me, who thought that if we built all of these additional mini products within our core offering, that we were going to scale the hell out of the business. And so we came up with first some models and mocks like this. And this was used for like kind of CPC based engagement marketing. So they would drop these engagement campaigns, usually in email, and they'd get a reaction from their customer base. And we had one product that was doing amazingly well. And so we said, well, why not have 5 or 6 products? So we got a little bit of validation. We put something like this in front of our customers and we'd say, would you use this and would you pay for this? Obviously it was more interactive than this screenshot, but if we built it, they all said yes. Absolutely. Yeah, we'll use it. Now, what I didn't do was I didn't ask like, how much will you be willing to pay for it? Will you pay for it right now in advance? I didn't do those things. And it was a complete and utter failure. I mean, the worst. Like we ended up spending 6+ months building stuff, and we increased our pricing as a result, and we lost our biggest clients, and we let most of the team go, and then went without pay for a very long time. So that was a horrible example of a false positive. So my guidance here is, if you're talking to customers and you're doing what you should be doing, which is doing customer development, have the honest conversation about the financial side of the deal early. So, and try to get commitments from them if you can. If I were going to do this again, I still would have probably had the idea, but the way I would approach it now is, hey, we have this really cool product. What are you willing to pay for this? Are you willing to use it? Yes. What do you think you're willing to pay for this? I think we'd add, for $500 a month, we'd use it. Okay, well, if you sign up today, I'll give it to you for the first year for $250 a month. Here's the Stripe payment URL. Literally, I would have them pay upfront in advance to avoid that false positive, and we just didn't do it. On the other side, like same company, the false negative around pricing. And so we were told by investors, by some of our customers, that a highly premium version would not sell and a cheap version would not sell. And it was just this part in the middle where it was this mid-market SaaS platform where we could sell. And neither of those scenarios turned out to be true. And I'll show you a screenshot later of what we ended up doing, where the product is actually at still today. But before that, I'd like to get into statistical significance a little bit. And so statistical significance, the definition is that it helps to quantify whether a result, the thing that you're doing, is likely due to chance or some level of interest, meaning like it's proven that it's effectively going to work. And it's really the difference between knowing if your results are based on luck or not. And again, as founders, you're not always going to want to look at statistical significance. That's part of the gamble of being an early stage founder, is you don't have it figured out yet. And luck will absolutely come into play. And my argument here is, generally, the more rapid experimentation you do, the faster you're going to get to that level of significance. But the things that make up statistical significance are sample size, your control data and your variant data, and then your risk tolerance. So the actual variance that you're comfortable with in terms of taking on risk. And that goes from kind of low to high. Around sample size, what the sample size is how many users are in the group or cohort that you're testing against. And the more volume you have, so if, consumer companies, you're going to have a lot more volume, the faster you're going to get to statistical significance. The lower volume, the longer it takes. If you've got very low volume, then you're going to need to be probably okay taking on a little bit more risk and being okay with the luck side of it a little bit more. Now, there's some calculators that you can use. This is the Optimizely A/B test sample size calculator. And what you can do here is you can say, okay, well, what is my baseline conversion rate? So what's that control? What percentage of people, for example, are getting to my pricing page and then converting? If it's 10%, what is the minimum relative change in the conversion rate that you want to be able to detect? So let's say I want to go from 10% to 11% or 12%, and I want to show a 20% relative increase in conversion. You can plug that number in. And then how much risk am I willing to take on? So you can literally drag this little slider and you can say, most platforms will actually start with a 95% statistical significance interval, but you can drag that down to 80 in this model or up to 99. And it'll show you how many users you need to put your product in front of to be statistically significant. So 2,500 is here. So 10, 20, and 80, remember that. 10, 20, 95. If I want to be even more confident, I'd have to add 400 more users, which again, you may or may not have the benefit of being able to get those extra 400 users to put the product in front of. So the way that I often look at this stuff is I'll usually err on the side of more risk, lower sample size, faster iteration, faster speed to learning. But that's a personal preference. And again, I'm fairly risk tolerant. And so it depends on your culture and how you feel as a founder, how much risk you'd want to take on. So another definition is your control data, right? So your control data is whatever that baseline is. And for any A/B test, that's going to basically be the starting point. That's going to be your jumping off point. So you want to understand, like, what is my control data and where does control data fit in? Is it, you're going to have control data on number of site visitors or app downloads to email capture or some first conversion, and then conversion to revenue, for example. There's likely multiple steps there. Generally, you're going to have conversion and control data at each and every step of that activation journey that your users go through. And then again, your risk tolerance. Early days, I like to take on a lot of risk, generally looking for that signal. And then over time, you'll get closer to statistical significance at scale. And that again might mean that you need to tune your software. If you use like Optimizely or Google Optimize or Mixpanel for A/B testing and experimentation, they usually lock down that risk tolerance and put it really, really, they want you to have low risk so that you can't blame their system if something gives you a false positive or false negative. So they'll usually start at 95%. And often you have to go into like advanced settings in these tools to pull it down to 80. That's an area to look though. And then some common problems. So why do experiments often fail? Just some of my observations. 9 times out of 10, it's usually because of you're just trying something that's too little. Like you're just placing too small of a bet. Or you're not giving whatever your experiment is enough time, or you're not getting enough volume, or some kind of combination of those three. And so I've seen like, a lot of this. I mean, this is an example at scale, but I see this all the time where you put an experiment out there, or your growth team or your product manager or your engineer is running an experiment, and it's just so similar to what the other thing that you're running is, whatever your control is, that weeks go by, thousands of users see it, and it's still significantly insignificant. Or you've just spent 2 or 3 months measuring something because you're too afraid to make a big change, and you see like a 1% conversion. Again, early on, think about how much risk you can take on to just dramatically change what the next iteration of your startup looks like. Google, had this famous study, this big experiment that they ran where they tested 41 shades of blue on their website. Sounds fun, but we're not Google. Like, you don't have the traffic that Google has. You can't test 41 shades of blue. And then again, sometimes those little changes really do add up, and look for those big swings. In this case below, this was a button text test, but again, it's usually like pretty small potatoes. When we look at not enough time, if you're running like a real statistical engine, again, like an Optimizely or Google Optimizer, one of those, and you just, you're at this baseline and you just can't beat it, again, try something different. And oftentimes, if you are at some level of scale, you just need more time to run the test. And then a very common challenge for us early stage founders is that you just have too low a volume. So what do? Use your intuition and take some guesses, right? The thing I showed you at the start, that's not scientific, and that's totally okay. And what we'll do on Monday is we'll review how many replies to our what's your most challenging growth problem. We'll look at that data as a team, and we'll kind of make some decisions on what to do next with that experiment. This is not a scientific experiment. Use your intuition, radically change one variable at a time. Like, one of the fastest ways to do this is to just dramatically change your pricing overnight. Again, risk tolerance comes into play there. If you're Netflix, you can't do that. And then let the test run as long as you need. So this example with Votion, my SaaS company that I keep coming back to, is how do you make sense of some of the data that you're seeing? And so we had heard with conviction from some folks that enterprise wouldn't work and that standard, and really was kind of in this middle. What's been interesting is every pricing scenario that we've put in front of the customer at the $49 and above standpoint has sold. And at this point in time, there's enterprise is maybe 10% of the deal flow, and then 50-50 on standard versus premium, which is interesting because the difference between standard and premium really isn't all that much, but we're anchoring premium against such an expensive enterprise that a lot of the signups are actually coming into that middle tier, when had we not run that premium, they'd all just get siphoned into that $49 a month. So there's a lot more to play with than you might think. And we're actually testing this on our membership page right now. So we've got 3 different models that we're experimenting with right now, to see how do we anchor pricing and how does that drive and change the adoption of the membership model that we have. And in our case there, what should we do? Could we get, if you see data like this too, that's like really low volume, what are things that you could do? Can we get 10% of visitors into a free trial? Because our lowest cost price was $49. So we are clearly leaving a lot of users on the table, right? Right here we had a lot of exits, some unique page views, a couple deals from that particular point in time. Could we upsell if we got people into the trial? So what happens if you get 10% of visitors now in and you sell 10% of them into a paid program? 500 visitors in a month, 50 trials, 5 subscribers over the next 3 months from an audience that would have just bounced, right? So again, when you're thinking about pricing, think about what experiment can you run that might be a free tier that has an upsell and cross sell. Now, we tried this at GrowthU and free did not work for us because the user was not engaged. When we moved to a $1 trial, they do need to get their credit card out. Some of you came in on the trial, you get your credit card out, you're already bought in. Like, now you're kind of showing up ready to do some of the work. And so I would start to look at some of those aspects of my product as where to go for experimentation and build the hypotheses from there. And then just know that experimentation is a team sport, right? You want to build a culture of experimentation as early as humanly possible within your business, in my opinion. If you're the boss, let your team take on some risk. Like, open it up for them because they have ideas. And to me, there's nothing worse than having ideas and not being able to test them. But you also probably want to delegate somebody to have some kind of ownership over the process and system. When I've been in-house or when I do mentorship or like work with, when we do one-on-one with our members and stuff, like we act as that internal growth team to help hold the founder accountable. And whether you work with somebody like us, or you've got a mentor or an advisor or somebody in-house, somebody needs to have some ownership and accountability over that experimentation pipeline and analyzing what's happening over time with those experiments, and make sure that that's open for everybody to see so that you can share in some of those wins and losses as you go. And with that, we're going to move into the last section, which is testing platforms. So I mentioned a few of these already. Google Firebase has an A/B testing suite. It's free. It's pretty good. It's pretty powerful. It actually works with native apps as well as web apps. So pretty easy. This is Mixpanel, so you can run A/B tests and things like that with Mixpanel. Mixpanel can get fairly expensive, but it's actually my personal favorite platform, but it's just expensive and it can be hard to set up. Optimizely used to have like a great free plan. They've moved enterprise, so they've priced themselves out, at least for most earlier stage startups. And then when you're thinking about channel stuff, this is an example of Facebook Dynamic Creative. Thanks, Jen. I stole your screenshot. But we test a lot in our channels as well. Like, what's the headline? What is the primary text? What's your description? And the good news with your ad platforms is you can experiment right within the platform by building dynamic creatives and things like that. This is Facebook. Google looks like this. This is very, very old ads that I decided to add in here. This was actually pre-Growth U, some of the stuff that I was experimenting with to understand, is our signal for like what we're doing here. And so again, notice you could put in like 10 or 15 different headlines, different descriptions, and you let those run and they compete against one another. It's still your job to like churn off or delete the stuff that's not working or scale the stuff that is. And that's it.